It's the final round of the Yerevan Blitz 2021, and on top board you have Harsha Bharathakoti with the white pieces against Praggnanandhaa. Praggnanandhaa has been simply dominating in the tournament with 7.5 out of 8. Harsha is on 6.5. It's going to be a very exciting game. 3 minutes plus 2 seconds increment, no shake hands, it's a fist bump. Opens the game with 1 e4 and Pragg goes for the Sicilian. Knight to c3, close Sicilian and bishop b5. Pragg moves his knight to d4. He wants to pick up the bishop, but Harsha simply ignores it. He develops his knight, and there Pragg is thinking, should I pick up the bishop? Knight takes b5, knight takes b5. That's another theory. Meanwhile, on the adjoining board, the two Armenians have just drawn their game quickly. Castles by Harsha and brings back the bishop. Now Pragg gets his knight back to c6. Generally, if the knight was on d4, white would have taken it, and then c takes d4, knight e2. Now Harsha plays a3. The idea of this move is to stop knight b4 in some cases, but also he is preparing rook to b1 and b4 break in the position. d6 by Pragg. Time-wise, both players have not used much. Rook to b1. The idea now is to expand with b4. Pragg thinks for a bit whether that idea is dangerous, and he just develops his knight to f6. b4. Pragg knows how to respond. He takes on b4, takes back and plays his pawn to d5. Very good positional decision. b4 pawn is slightly weak. The bishop is coming to b7. Pragg's position looks really good. Harsha now has to decide how to continue in this position. His bishop on d3 looks slightly weird, so he puts his knight back to e2. Now one of the plans can be to get the knight to g3 so that you have more pieces on the king side. Pragg develops his bishop and gets ready for short castle. c3 is a nice move by Harsha, because now the bishop can drop back to c2 and white can expand in the center with d4. That's the plan in the position. Pragg is taking his time. He develops his bishop to b7, and there you go, bishop c2. And that was his plan, knight to e5. Notice Harsha's time here, 2 minutes 20 seconds on the clock, but he knows this is the critical moment of the game. If he moves his knight from f3, then the e4 pawn is hanging. But if he takes on e5, then after d takes e5, although black's pawns are doubled, the d file is opened up. So it's not an easy decision to make, especially in a blitz game. If this was a classical encounter, one could imagine that white would take a lot of time. There, Harsha's piece falls down, and in blitz, every second is important. Harsha takes on e5, d takes e5 and places his pawn on d3. That was a very measured decision by him. Now the e4 pawn is well guarded. Although his pieces look a little bit cramped there, Harsha is hoping that his center control will limit the bishop on b7 and also the knight on f6. How should Pragg continue now is the question. You can see Pragg looking very relaxed. He has had a good run in this tournament, but finishing on a high is important. He short castles in the position. And now Harsha is thinking about developing his bishop to e3, but first plays h3 so that the bishop is not hassled with knight g4. Also, somewhere you are thinking about the f4 break in this position, and you really don't want a knight arriving on g4 here. So h3 is a good solid move. Pragg can now play active moves like knight h5, aiming to look at the f4 square, and other possibilities also exist. Pragg decides to move his knight to d7. You can see time-wise, Harsha has 12 seconds more than Pragg here. Bishop e3, once again, very calmly played, developing the bishop. Harsha knows that strategically, he's slightly better here because he has the center control. Also, Pragg's pawns are doubled. It's not a big handicap, but king h8 is a clear sign of war. Pragg wants to push his pawn to f5 and his mood is king. So now Harsha is thinking, is f5 a big threat that I should be worrying about? Should I go for f4 and start my play before Pragg does? These are important decisions to be made, but you have only 1 minute 18 seconds on the clock. He plays queen d2. He's like, let Pragg play f5. I'm okay with it. Queen to d2 and Pragg goes for f5, and look at Harsha's reaction. So calm. f3. This is a brilliant decision by Harsha. Knight to f6, and now Harsha is looking at the position whether any tactics are occurring on the e4 square. Not really. Everything seems to be secure, and he puts his bishop on d3, making Pragg regret about the weakness on e6. Rook d1 defends his pawn on d3, and now Harsha has a very nice plan in his mind. He moves his queen to a2, attacking the pawn on e6. You can see that Pragg did not expect that move. All of a sudden, the e6 pawn has been weakened beyond measure. That was the drawback of pushing your pawn to f5. Now, how do you defend it? Bishop c8 was very passive. There was an interesting idea with queen c6 with some tactics on e4, but Pragg goes passive now with bishop c8, and white is clearly better. Look at black pieces, so discoordinated. How should white now try to proceed? And there you go, Harsha plays d4. Pragg had his move prepared, queen to a7. He's now telling Harsha, if you take on e5, your bishop on e3 is hanging. So bishop f2 is one possibility here, defending your bishop, or king f2. The problem with king f2 is that black would go f4, and then the bishop has to leave that diagonal. Harsha is down to 30 seconds. He has to speed up, while Pragg has 49 seconds. He moves his king to f2. Now, the threat is d takes e5, and the queen will be attacked, and also the knight on f6. How should Pragg react to this? It's not an easy decision. This is a very complicated position, but that's the thing about Blitz. You don't have enough time. You have to make the decisions on the spur of the moment. Pragg pushes his pawn to f4. Bishop goes back to d2 now. So for a moment, the d4 pawn is pinned, but the knight on e2 is doing a commendable job of holding it for now. If white moves his king away, queen b6 has been played. If he moves his king away, then already he's better. That's what Harsha does. Now king to f1, and what a move. Bishop e1. He's rerouting his bishop to f2. Such positional maneuvers are very difficult to make with less time, but this just shows how good Harsha is. Pragg, realizing that he's lost the battle in the center, opens the queen side, but that's not going to help him so much. He has activated his rook, but Harsha simply moves his queen away. Once again asking Pragg, what about the center tension there? Rook to a6 so that the e6 pawn is safe, and bishop f2, queen goes back. Now, Pragg, for the time being, has got everything covered. His e6 pawn is safe, but his pieces on knight on h5, rook on a6 do not look so great. King g1 played by Harsha, just improving his king. Also h6 by Pragg so that later there are no back rank issues. Doubling down the d file, rook d2 is a nice move by Harsha Bharathakoti here. Bishop b7, he brings his rook to the center, and Pragg now down to his last 4, 3, 2. Oh, he's down to last second, and he makes his move with 2-second increment. Now again, queen a2, attacking the e6 pawn. You can see how e6 weakness has haunted black so much. And there you have white winning a pawn on e5. Pragg has survived that immense time trouble. He is now up to some 4 seconds. Harsha also making his moves quickly so that he gets some seconds. And here Pragg pawn down, defends his pawn on e6, and Harsha moves in to the kill with his queen on a7. Queen to c6, and now exchanging the queens once again. Here we are into an endgame. Both players have very little time, and he loses the pawn on b5. So white is now 2 pawns up. Bishop a6 attacks the bishop on c7, and now Harsha brings back his bishop to d4. You can see how Pragg quickly makes his moves, but Harsha knows that if he maintains his calm, he should be winning this endgame. He's 2 pawns up, pushes his pawn to c4, exchanges, gets his knight back, and now what's the next thing you do? e6 is weak, so the next thing you do is bring your king into the game. So king g1, king f2, the king is entering, knight to e8, king f2, and now bishop to c4, dominating the knight on c7. And there you have it. Harsha being so confident. Now close to 11 seconds on his clock with a completely winning position. You can see the desperation in Prag's moves. King coming to a5, b6. What a nice play by Harsha. In fact, he has made no mistakes in this game. He pushes his pawn to c7, king d7, check on b5, and now bishop a6 seems like over. Look at the amount of crowd that has gathered around the board. Pragg is losing his first game. There you go. It's a queen on the board, and he's now a complete piece down, and Praggnanandhaa now resigns the game. What a fight between two Indians on the top board. Harsha moved to 7.5 as well in the tournament, but Pragg won the event on better tie break. Harsha finished second. A great match by both the youngsters, especially Harsha.